残酷な天使のように少年よ神話になれ青い風が今胸のドアを叩いても私だけをただ見つめて微笑んでるあなたそっとくれるもの求めることに夢中で運命さえまだ知らない痛いけな瞳だけどいつか気づくでしょうその背中には未来目指すための羽があること残酷な天使の手で窓辺からやがて飛び立つほとばしる熱いパトスで思い出を裏切るならこの空を抱いて輝く少年よ神話にな
The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker is a prime example of how I, Phantom Bane, am a complete stupid asshole. When I first played this game, I took one look at the graphics and I said, fuck this game. I'm 6 years old, I'm an adult, my grandma's a Navy SEAL. It turns out that I wasn't the only one who thought this way. A lot of people were salty about the game's art direction. Now in defense of those people, you have to remember, the last two Zelda games that came out were Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. Now, even though Ocarina and Majora are both rated E, these games are fucked up, seriously. Whoever came up with this guy should be locked away. It's also important to remember this CG demo that Nintendo came to E3 with. Now that's a hell of a demo, and it sure looks pretty different from Wind Waker. Of course, this wasn't for an actual game as much as it was for showing off the GameCube's capabilities. Also, keep in mind that Wind Waker came out in 2003. The late 90s, well into the 2000s, was the edgy age. Remember all the dumb emo music that was always on the radio? Remember that stupid-ass Coldplay song that was just ripping off of Pokemon? Remember the Matrix trilogy? Christopher Nolan's Batman trilogy? Shadow the Hedgehog? Even Nintendo's competitors were in on the loop, making their consoles all gritty and badass looking. But hey, the GameCube had a handle. Great. Now you'll never have to worry about dropping it. I think it was only destiny that Nintendo would follow up Wind Waker with Twilight Princess. Naturally, all this worked forcefully against Wind Waker, but in recent years I think a lot of people have come around to the game's look. What a lot of people should understand is that when you aim for a less realistic art style, the graphics tend to age much better. Just look at Mario 64. On a purely technical level, this game's graphics have been decimated by pretty much any game that has come out after it. But it's still nice to look at. Wind Waker isn't winning any awards either, but it's aged a lot better than Twilight Princess. This game might have more realistic graphics, but since big budget games are always pushing towards hyper-realism, games like this just get left in the dust, and that's exactly what happened. Twilight Princess makes my eyeballs want to slash their wrists. Wind Waker, on the other hand, is just much nicer to look at, even to this day. It's bright, it's colorful, and it's just appealing. Wind Waker starts out by giving a retrospective, loosely explaining the events of Ocarina of Time. It says that generations after Ganon is defeated, he returns, and it's implied that he destroyed Hyrule. Despite this, the legend of the Hero of Time still slipped through the cracks and made it to a little island. As such, it became a long-time tradition that when boys became a certain age, they dressed like the hero. And guess what? Happy birthday! You're now old enough to go stab things. Unfortunately, it turns out that Ganon is out kidnapping girls who look vaguely like Zelda, because I guess you gotta be thorough, right? I mean, this is Ganon we're talking about. He doesn't fuck around with this shit. Turns out Link's sister fits the bill, so she gets kidnapped. Link is forced to leave his tiny island to join these pirates to get her back. One of the things this game captures really well within the first few hours is the really emotional scenario of leaving the nest. In Ocarina, you have no real family, and because of this, Link just kind of accepts the fact that he has to leave and save the world. But here, there's a very serious emotional weight to it because he actually has something to lose. He grew up in an environment where literally nothing bad ever happens, and now that something bad has happened, he's forced to man up and go deal with it. Look how sad he is as he waves goodbye to every single person he ever knew. Then fucking Tetra steps in and berates him for being sentimental. Honestly, she's gotta be my favorite character. The whole time she's just kind of cocky and cynical. She's just cool. But if there's one character that rivals Tetra, it's gotta be Nico! My cousin! Wind Waker's story and presentation might not be as dark and macabre, maybe as Majora's Mask, but it doesn't really need to be. Remember my Star Fox video where I talked about how Star Fox isn't a very adaptable series? Well, Zelda is one of those weird series that's surprisingly versatile in that regard. Even though the Zelda series is constantly changing, the games can each stand alone as their own amazing title. Mostly. And honestly, considering the earliest Zelda games were largely bright and cartoony themselves, it's really not straying that far from home when you think about it. Wind Waker has an immense amount of personality to it. All the characters are very distinctive and expressive. Link himself is incredibly animated and is able to convey so much emotion. In fact, the game is surprisingly emotional. You won't see anything like Cafe's quest, but it is still pretty turbulent at times. Like Link's grandma, the whole time she's just so broken up about the fact that one of her grandchildren is kidnapped and the other one is on a suicide mission to get her back, and that's just crushing to see. Another great thing about Wind Waker is the combat. The swordplay has been jacked way up from the previous games. They added in this awesome parry move that lets you counter an enemy's attack. Enemies can now drop weapons for you to pick up and use against them. Enemies can actually hit each other by accident. My favorite enemies are these guys, because when they lose their swords, they just start pulling some kung fu shit on you. The only issue I have with the combat is how the enemies sometimes get these stupid invincibility frames that seem disconnected with what they're actually doing. This might seem like a minor complaint, but it really grinds the fuck out of my gears sometimes. In Majora and Ocarina, the enemy would turn red when you hit them to loosely indicate invincibility frames, which doesn't seem to happen in this game. When it comes to navigation, Wind Waker really takes it in the ass for the first half of the game. In between temples, so much of your time is spent sailing halfway across the ocean to get to the other islands to do a bunch of stuff to advance the plot and whatnot. This gets real old real fast. Eventually you get a fast travel system that mitigates this issue, which is pretty great. For the most part, Wind Waker's pacing is pretty good, and by that I mean the game doesn't have a water temple. Well, not in the conventional sense at least. If you want to start arguing semantics, you could say the whole game is a water temple. But just know that if you do that, I'll slap you across the face with a goddamn fish. What I mean by this is, since you can't go underwater in this game, that extra level of intricacy that makes most water levels really asinine is removed, and therefore it's easier. I like challenge, but I've generally considered water levels like that to be the antithesis of fun. So it's nice that Wind Waker doesn't have a water temple like that. It does, however, have this really asinine part near the end. It's a semi-major spoiler, but it's pretty asinine to the point that I'd call it the closest thing this game has to a water temple. So if you don't want it spoiled though, just skip to this time. So once you've beaten the main temples, you have to go find the 8 shattered pieces of the Triforce of Courage. Only problem is that they're submerged in the ocean, so what you have to do is sail all around the place searching for Triforce charts to give you the location of the pieces. But they don't just give you the information because they haven't been decoded yet. So how do you decode them? Well, you need to talk to Tingle, which means you have to break him out of prison. But despite you saving his ass, he doesn't decode the charts for free. He charges like 400 rupees per chart. Now your default wallet can only hold 200 rupees, so you need to unlock a bigger wallet just to be able to hold enough money. Then you have to start farming rupees in this stupid cave, which gets you maybe 600 rupees at a time. So you have to go in there like 5 times to get enough money for all the charts. But then, even when you have all the charts decoded, it doesn't automatically put the points on your map. You have to manually cross-reference the charts with the map, which means you have to feed all these goddamn fish so they can fill out your map so you can actually see the islands on the map. Then you gotta physically go to the place on the map to fish for the treasure chests. Just do that shit 8 times. That's probably the worst part of the game, but that's not really saying much because the rest of the game is pretty great. The temples are actually really fun because they added a bunch of new items. They got the slingshot, they got the Deku leaf, and my favorite, the hammer. Check this shit out. Die. The temples themselves are pretty fun. Unfortunately, like Majora's Mask, there's only 4 temples. Despite this game is still pretty big, so it's not much of an issue. But while I brought up Majora's Mask, I just want to say that the massive sea makes the game feel a little sparse in comparison with Majora's Mask, which was a very densely packed game. Nevertheless, the world of Wind Waker is still rich in secrets and treasures, so no worry there. One of the things that never ceases to amaze me is just how well Zelda games manage to pull off such incredible atmosphere. Wind Waker, despite its less realistic aesthetic, manages to be immensely atmospheric. Have you ever played a video game and it actually elicited a physical reaction? Like you could actually feel the game? The first dungeon, the Fire Temple if you will, actually makes me feel as though the room temperature is rising, which is a godsend because the room I'm currently living in is somehow really cold even though it's August. But this isn't owed only to the graphics but also to the soundtrack. It seems as though Koji Kondo just can't do wrong. Everything he touches just turns to gold. No matter how you feel about the actual game in general, if Koji Kondo is there, then you can take solace in the fact that at least the music's gonna be good. Is there a Koji Kondo composed game that has bad music? I wanna know. But I imagine the answer is no. Wind Waker is often criticized for not being enough like Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, so in response Nintendo made Twilight Princess, and then that game was criticized for being too much like Ocarina. Usually I'd say you can't please everyone, but this time the proper expression is you can't please anyone. But though I admit that it took me a while to come around, I found that Wind Waker is an outstanding game that I would easily recommend to anybody. It's fun, it rewards exploration, it's easy on the eyes and the ears, it's full of lovable characters, and it tells a great story. That pretty much covers all the bases for a Zelda game as far as I can tell. And even though the whole boat thing kinda slows the game way down, it's not a deal breaker. It could easily have been much worse. Like, imagine if there were load screens, that'd be fucked up. So if you're put off by the childish, cartoony look of the game, I'm telling you, just keep an open mind. You'll be pleasantly surprised. It might actually charm you a bit. It grew on me after a while, so just give it a chance.